to today's webinar about the nexus between housing and economic development. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mary Waldron. I'm the Executive Director of the Old Colony Planning Council. For those not familiar with OCPC, we're a regional planning agency for most of Plymouth County and a few neighboring towns. We assist over 17 communities in planning for present and future needs, utilizing our local knowledge, technical experience, and regional collaboration. To learn more about us, OCPC, visit us at ocpcrpa.org. Before we begin, I'd like to thank OCPC's Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy Committee, otherwise known as CEDS, for co-hosting this webinar. The co-chairs, are Mary Ellen Brett of Massasoit Community College and John Murray of Mass Higher Greater Brockton Career Center. They've been leading the CEDS committee through a collaborative process to strengthen our regional economy. This webinar is part of that work. Today, we're welcoming 3 speakers, and they're amazing speakers, and I've known them each in different capacity and probably combined about 150 years. So we'll be hearing from Peter Foreman, the President and CEO of South Shore Chamber of Commerce, about how housing helps drive the economy in the region. The economy and economic development in the region. The South Shore Chamber has a membership of over 1,000 corporations, small to mid-sized businesses, nonprofit, educational institutions, restaurants, and sole proprietors. Prior to joining the Chamber, Peter worked briefly in the private sector and for more than 20 years in state and county government. His government services includes 14 years in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, 5 years as sheriff of Plymouth County, and 2 years as a senior advisor to 2 governors. We'll then hear from Judi Barrett, planning director, owner, operating manager of Barrett Planning Group, which is growing by leaps and bounds because she's got to move out of her own space. Judi will help us understand what the profile of a pro-housing community looks like. With over 30 years of planning and community development experience, both in state and local government, as well as in consulting. Judi has devoted her career to building municipal capacity to solve difficult public policy questions and develop effective leadership and advocacy skills. She is well known for her work in affordable and fair housing policy and inclusionary zoning. Our third speaker will be our very own Dottie Fulginiti. Dottie is OCPC's Economic Recovery Planner. She'll be speaking about how communities can garner local political buy-in and work with partners to deliver. In addition to her role in helping Old Colony communities recover and develop, she also serves as the chair of the Easton Select Board. In her 8 years on the Select Board, she has worked to increase the town's subsidized housing inventory from 3% to 10%. Prior to OCPC, Dottie was Director of Local Leadership for Massachusetts Smart Growth Alliance, where she worked with communities to help them achieve their housing goals. We'll be taking questions at the end of the 3 presentations. Please submit your questions through the Q&A button and during any time of the presentation. If you prefer to ask a question live, please click the raise hand button when the time comes and we will call on you. And before I even move off into my next section for the introduction, I do want to be able to give Joanne Zigman, our senior economic and environmental planner, just kudos on pulling this together, working with Dottie, of course, but really organizing and working with the team and really pulling this together for you. So thank you, Joanne, for your work. And I'd also just like to recognize Becky Coletta, who is our member of our Old Colony Planning Council delegate from the town of Pembroke. So thank you for joining us as not only as a member of the Pembroke, but also as our council member. So a recording of this webinar will be available in the next couple days. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to you, Peter, and thank you all for being part of this panel.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Joanne, for pulling it together. We've been using housing as a deliberate economic strategy for the South Shore for the last few years. And to give some perspective on how we got there, I started thinking when Mary was mentioning that how far back some of us go. I think I only go back 40 years with you. And that was at our time up at the State House, when a lot of the issues then were about urban flight, the decay of cities, and the overwhelming of municipal services because of movement and housing, and how there was so much interest from suburban legislators. I'll plead guilty, that includes me, worked to zone out housing to control growth. At that time, it was considered a way to protect municipal services and in some ways to protect the environment, to make it more difficult to have this mass migration and movement out of cities into suburbs. And then when I returned to the State House in the 95, 98 area, Mary, I think you had left by then. Then the issue was on pricing because housing was very expensive. And now that we're at the chamber, the issue for us isn't so much about how you artificially reduce pricing for some product, but how you use housing as an economic strategy for the South Shore, for the suburbs, not to block it, but to use it to attract people, businesses, and build up your community centers. So when we looked at our region, we realized very quickly that the South Shore had a very serious economic challenge in that we were aging faster than other metropolitan areas. And we had to change the demographics. And the way you do that is with housing. Now, for us, that was not simply supporting all of the existing programs to lower some housing costs for some people, but it was to diversify the housing product. We realized that so much of the suburban housing market are large lot, single detached family housing, and that's not what people were looking to do. And we were still, and continue to this day in many ways, to continue to build housing product that responds to old zoning strategies rather than current market interests. And those market interests come from young professionals who aren't having large families and downsizing baby boomers who are looking for different products. And that's why we've been so supportive of looking at multifamily housing, smaller lot, compact neighborhood divisions. And where you build that product turns out to be important as well, because people, while they still have options to be in woods or large lots and open space, a lot of people want to be closer to some activity. They're not looking for all the maintenance in the yard, and they want activity. And for years, we seem to have pushed housing in the suburbs away from activity because zoning was sort of pure building block mentality. All of your activity in one area, or all of your housing in another, all of your businesses. And we have to mix that up as well. So we're pleased with the progress we've been making. We're very pleased with the interest and support we get from some municipal leaders. They recognize that the key to revitalizing their downtowns or blighted areas or attracting people is through housing. And they're trying to figure out how you have this big shift from where Mary and I were in the 80s, when we're up in the legislature stopping things, to where we are now with OCPC and the South Shore Chamber, trying to move things along in order to protect the suburbs and protect local services.
I think those are great comments, Peter. When I was with the Mass Smart Growth Alliance, we did a lot of work together and spoke to a lot of the businesses down there. And it takes a little bit of time to get people on the same page, but more and more people are starting to really see that connection between economic development and housing. Judi, if you want to go next.
I do. And Joanne, were you going to bring my slides up?
Yes, I will do that right now for you, Judi.
Super, thank you. I'm old enough to need slides so that I keep track of what I'm going to say. It's just that point in my life.
All right, they're up.
So I was happy to be asked to join this. And I go back with Peter to the late 1980s when I was the community development director in Plymouth. And, you know, that was a time when there was really tremendous disconnect between at the economic development and housing worlds. And I never really understood why that was the case. In my younger days, it made absolutely no sense to me that housing and community development people were in these like different planes, and yet they were. And in many ways, I find that that is still the case. So I was asked to address what a pro-housing community looks like, and to sort of talk about 3 things that communities should think about on a going forward basis to sort of do almost a self-diagnosis or a self-assessment of their housing, and I would say economic development nexus. So if we could go to the next slide, that would be great. There are 3 ways that municipalities can lead anything. One is with leadership and policy development, and that always has to come first. Regulatory opportunities, communities certainly know how to regulate growth out. When they know how to regulate growth out, they would know how to regulate it in. But you can't get to the regulatory phase until you've kind of got that policy framework in place. And the third thing municipalities can do is invest. So whether it's housing or economic development or open space or anything else, you need these 3 pieces in alignment. So I want to talk about how each one kind of plays out with respect to housing. Next slide, please. So what does it mean to have a pro-housing perspective? This is where that kind of overarching policy framework comes from. A few months ago, I was in a meeting where someone said somewhat disparagingly that I'm a passionate housing advocate. And at the time I thought affordable housing advocate to be exact. And at the time I thought, oh my goodness, somebody doesn't like me. And then I realized about, I don't know, a half hour later after speaking with someone else that I actually should just take it as a compliment. And I have learned to do that. I am a housing advocate and I'm very proud of it. And I think that communities that don't have a strong housing advocacy voice are missing critical opportunities to support economic development. So the first question I ask, whenever I'm looking at sort of a community from a housing perspective is, where's your city or town manager? Are they involved in leading a discussion? How about your mayor or your select board? Where are they in this conversation? A lot of times people assume it's kind of the planning department that has to deal with this stuff, but the planning departments can only do so much at a staff level. It needs to become from the kind of leadership at the top. Where's your planning board? Where's your economic development commission? Are these people all talking, and are they all speaking out of the same mouth about the importance of housing as an economic development tool? What does your city or town master plan say about where to encourage mixed uses and higher density housing? And does it say something, and has it actually been implemented? Have you been able to produce affordable housing as a direct result of implementing your master plan? It starts there really with what's your planning framework? Do your economic development commission and housing trust or partnership communicate ever? One of the things I find in communities I work in is that the economic development advocates, if you will, are on one commission and the housing advocates are on another commission. And because they're all volunteers and they're busy, they hardly ever get a chance to speak. So thinking about ways that you can facilitate a communication between those volunteers, all of whom are very interested in a particular subject that is inextricably tied, would be a way to think about how do you build a better framework and a policy framework for housing. Next slide, please. Where are you on equity and affordable housing? We can't ignore this discussion anymore. We shouldn't have been ignoring it for a long time. It's in our face now, and I'm glad that it is. Housing insecurity is not evenly distributed across the population. It is disproportionately an impact on people of color, on older people, people living on low incomes, and I would also add people with disabilities, many of whom are trying to work and have transportation barriers and can't work as a result. High quality, stable housing is essential for the health and well-being of families. It helps foster relationships and opportunities in communities. It limits chronic stress and reduces food insecurity. In many of the suburbs I work in, people talk about liking to be a family-oriented community. But one of the questions you might want to ask yourself is what families are able to thrive in your town? And how does housing relate to that? Next slide, please. Regulatory tools. As I said earlier, communities know how to zone out growth. I tell you that communities can zone it in as well. And of course, if your master plan is clear and place-based, then you know where to target those regulations. Because I don't think any planner would say, just open up your entire town to whatever housing you want. You know, thinking about place-based, node development, that's all very appropriate planning. So questions to consider in looking at yourselves as a community and where you stand on housing is, do you have inclusionary zoning? And what has it actually produced? Is it working? I have towns say to me all the time, well, we have inclusionary zoning, but it doesn't produce any housing. Well, then you look at the zoning and you can kind of see why. So if it doesn't make economic sense, no one's going to use it. Where do you encourage a mix of different types of housing? Have you actually thought about this from a place-based perspective in your plan? Now do your regulations support that outcome? Do you allow multifamily units at a realistic density in your town center or neighborhood commercial centers or somewhere? Years ago, I was being playful one night and I was in GIS and I decided to open up the statewide land use map. And I just turned off all the layers except industrial uses and multifamily housing. And it was just this striking picture of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts with orange multifamily blobs and pink and purple industrial blobs, all at the sort of edges of town, or kind of just adjacent to major highways. And I thought, well, talk about not integrating people into our community. This is really sort of a good picture of it. If you have any public transportation in your community, do you encourage a housing mix, including affordability within walking distance of transportation? It's an excellent resource. People need to be able to get to it. And as I alluded to in the previous slide or two, especially for people with disabilities and lower incomes, to get to work, having access to public transportation is really kind of a basic. If you have a train station or commuter ferry, have you created a transit-oriented mixed-use district? That's a classic opportunity. And so these are things you can look at for regulatory tools to help you advance a housing agenda that's more supportive of economic development. Next slide, please. Have you taken the time to actually study the wage levels and the housing prices in your community? This is really basic. What is the impact on housing costs on your local workers? Is there a disconnect between what they make and what they can afford? And so when you're looking at wage levels, you might also look at where people are commuting from. I had an experience recently of working on a master plan where people were saying, you know, the whole problem with traffic in this town is because we've got more housing now. We have these big multifamily developments. But when you actually looked at their commuting patterns today versus 20 years ago, which was the last time they did their master plan, the number of people commuting into that town from outside and from farther distances was ever greater than it had been before. So they had had some success in opening up industrial manufacturing, you know, higher end professional development opportunities, as well as retail around those nodes. But people working in those lower wage jobs were commuting from well outside the community because they couldn't find housing. Have you talked to your local workers or your local business owners? Not just, and I mean the business tenants and not just the property owners. There's a real estate piece to this. There's also, can I operate a business in this community piece? So if you're trying to understand the needs of your businesses, talk to your business owners and find out, are they having issues recruiting employees or keeping employees? Do you have opportunities in your town to use kind of proven tools like Chapter 40R or Chapter 40B to increase your housing supply? Both of these are readily available. And even if your community is over the 10% minimum under Chapter 40B, you can still use it to create more housing if you're having trouble leading a conversation toward regulatory change. If you can't achieve regulatory reform, you still can use tools like Chapter 40B. As a planner, of course, I would much rather recommend that you use tools like Chapter 40R and do some place-based planning and target your regulations accordingly. What's the demographic makeup of your community? How does it compare to the region? Is there a disconnect? And then on this note, I would say, have you ever done a racial impact study to evaluate whether your current rules disproportionately affect Black people and people of color? Again, we can't ignore this conversation anymore. In our region, in our suburbs, in our cities, we have to have these conversations if we intend to support both housing equity and also support the diversity of jobs that we say that we want in our towns. Next slide, please. So I just have a couple of comments on investments as well. Communities certainly know how to invest. They know how to build schools. They can build town halls. They can install sewers if they're so motivated. They can build police stations. They invest. So what does your town plan say about targeted development? Where are your opportunity nodes? And have you aligned your capital spending commitments with your planning goals? I've worked on some planning from time to time in Rhode Island, and I'm always impressed in Rhode Island at how closely the planning departments are involved with capital planning. I rarely see that in Massachusetts. It's this very strange disconnect. Is your capital plan kind of just a sidebar to the annual budget process, or does your planning department, economic development commission, housing partnership, and finance or advisory committee actually work together to develop your 5-year capital plan? Do you have a 5-year capital plan, by the way? That's an important question. But your investments will have a direct impact on where you can facilitate growth and, frankly, where you want to discourage it as well. Have you funded a full-time economic development director? Do you have a municipal housing director? This is really about having the capacity to do the things that a community needs to do to support both healthy economic development and sustainability and housing equity. You need this capacity. If your town is too small, I get it, but think about ways you can work with other communities in your region to have that capacity in place, either through your regional planning agency or perhaps through some type of interlocal agreement with a few communities, smaller communities adjacent to you. Next slide, please. And last, by the way. Does your community preservation committee work closely with your affordable housing trust? Do you automatically transfer your CPA housing funds to the affordable housing trust and let them decide how best to invest those dollars? I work in so many places where there's a CPA committee or community preservation committee and a housing trust. And there's always this tension around who's going to control the decisions about CPA funds. If you are on a CPA community and you willingly sort of take input from the conservation, open space, and historic preservation folks, recognize that your affordable housing trust is the entity you want to build up to know how to invest in the housing needs in your community. Does your city or town council or town meeting make those non-CPA resources available for affordable housing development? Communities can do that. Often they don't, but you certainly can think about targeting non-CPA funds to support the kind of housing that you want to create. Have you done a municipal land study and identified potential locations for affordable housing? Land is something that is one of a community's best tools for creating deep affordability. Have you invested in a comprehensive housing strategy for your town? Having a housing production plan under Chapter 40B is important. It isn't necessarily a community comprehensive housing strategy. So how have you done that? And if not, I would recommend that you actually do that. And do you pay for training each year for your planning board, your board of appeals, other boards and municipal staff in economic development strategies, sort of a best practices approaches to economic development and to housing? And I would say wrapping all that together is really the field of community development. Do you provide training in those tools? So those are kind of my thoughts about what does a pro-housing community do? And if you want to be a pro-housing community, these are things you can think about.
Thanks. It's hard to go after you, Judi, with all of those. That's a lot of great information, and Peter. So I guess I'll approach this from the standpoint of being an elected official in a small suburban community. We have about 25,000 people in Easton, so it's getting a little bit bigger. I would say that the best plans sit on the shelf unless there's political buy-in. And I don't know how many of you have sat in the room in front of a handful of people that are angry that you're talking about housing and had to answer those questions. But it's not pleasant, and it's really uncomfortable for a lot of people, especially for newly elected people. Um, what I would say to that is that you really have to think about the big picture of who's really in your community, and it's not really represented by the people that generally go to those meetings. BU did a housing study, and it's in the, if you go search for housing politics lab from BU, you'll see there's a one-page summary, and then there's a longer document that talks about over people interviewed over the years. The people that actually go to meetings are older, whiter, male homeowners. And the way that we do our public meetings really isn't conducive to young families or people that are, commuting into town or things like that. So what we've tried to do in our town is to really encourage people to not only attend the meetings, but to communicate with us, send us letters, talk to us, let us know your housing experience. And we also encourage people to be joining our boards and committees that are not usually the ones that serve on boards and committees. So people that rent, people that are older, people that are younger, people of different racial backgrounds. And it's very intentional. We go out and we seek and recruit people. We have a really great planning board, and I'm not just saying that because the chair of our planning board is on this call today, but they really do an amazing job, and they're very forward thinking about zoning and the places that we zone for certain types of housing, like compact neighborhoods and things like that. So when you spoke, Judi, about the zoning and the planning and the elected officials and the CPA and the Affordable Housing Trust working together, I think that that's really important as well. I would say that for the elected officials to set the tone for the conversation. And when you say housing, it just sounds like a word, like a term. But when you talk about neighbors and neighborhoods and the people that live in them and the people that shop at your businesses and go to your schools and take advantage of your beautiful open spaces, that paints a picture of what everybody wants their vibrant community to look like. I know in our town, we really want to see more businesses, but we've had the challenge that we don't have public sewer. So we've used sewer housing as a catalyst to bring in sewer, which in turn brings the economic development opportunities. And it sounds strange to do that, but it's really worked out very well for us. When I talk with other communities and they ask how do they get these things going and talk to their communities about it, I think people have a hard time visualizing, if you say we're going to put 120 units of housing on 7 acres of land, what does that look like? So see who's done it in other communities. We have the shovel works. And if you went up there, you'd say, this is beautiful. I could picture myself living here. And when you tell them it's 120 units on 7 acres of land, then they can visualize and understand what that means. Or in your downtowns, if you want to have higher building heights, to say we're going to allow 4 or 5 stories in the suburbs, we think that's a skyscraper. So go to a place that has 4 or 5 story buildings in their downtown and actually see it with your own eyes and say, oh, I get how this design works. It's not sticking up on its own. It's part blended into a more comprehensive design. And also to do a fiscal impact analysis, look at what are the costs that the community will bear for this and what are the incentives of this. There's the typical things like you're going to have permitting and licensing fees and excise tax and more tax revenue. But also, if you are really understanding of municipal finance, this raises your tax base with new growth. And that's really important because if you don't have new growth in your community, your tax level is going to be pretty flat. And I know in communities like Easton, it makes it really hard to meet our budget. I would say take a field trip to other communities and see what they're doing and see what you like, and talk to other elected officials. Enlist the support of other groups, whether they're local groups, advocacy groups, also allies that you might not think of, like bike and pedestrian groups, transportation groups. environmental groups, you know, try to get people on board with the bigger picture of the conversation. And I guess really just try to change the conversation. Inevitably, at any of these presentations, someone is going to say, well, this is going to bring school-age children to our community, which really hurts me on a personal and a professional level, because I have kids that live in this community. A lot of us do, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. And if you have the data to look at and anticipate these questions when you do a fiscal impact analysis, you're probably going to see that over the last 10 years, your school enrollment has declined. In most communities, it has. And I won't be bold to say every community, because that's not necessarily the case. But take a look at that and what that means. Families are such an important, vital part of your community. I did a presentation once, and a gentleman was giving me like some angry looks the whole time when I was talking about these issues. And he came up to me after the end of the presentation, and I was really nervous. And he said, you know, I wish we had this conversation where I live, because we started building only over 55 housing. And when we did that, guess what happened? All the businesses left. And then our whole downtown has tumbleweeds blowing down the downtown, and it's not a vibrant community. So you really do need that mix of, we want to have our older residents be able to afford to live in our community and stay here, maybe have a place to downsize, which would free up the bigger house they have so that we can be welcoming to a new family. And those families contribute to our community in so many ways. Neighbor Works Housing Solutions had one of the best videos that I've ever seen. And it showed little kids playing house with dolls and doll houses, and then it showed them making forts in the living room with, you know, we've all done that. And we all think of housing as a security from when we're young through our whole age group, and, you know, doing homework at the kitchen table, those having meals together with your family. That's what housing is. It's not the walls and the roof and the size of the house. It's really part of the community. So I think it's important to talk like that when you talk about housing in your community. And also to remind people that, you know, it's discriminatory language to say that you don't want a certain kind of a group, whether that's families with kids or, you know, anybody else, to not be welcome in your community. It's just not the way to talk about housing. And I guess, you know, going back to the master plan, the housing trust, looking at all those documents, having that information handy and using that as a tool to describe, help make the connection on why housing helps the economic benefit for your town. Businesses come to your community because you do have housing, because you have foot traffic in your downtowns. And if people don't look at the whole picture like that, that can be really a challenge. So with that, I'm going to turn that back over to Joanne.
Thank you, Dottie. All right, so we've got quite a few questions coming through. If you do want to ask a question, please type it into the chat, use the Q&A button, or you can also raise your hand. So we're going to start with one taking us back to Judy's comments about affordable housing trusts. So the statement in question is, I understand that it makes sense to have the Affordable Housing Trust utilize the housing portion of the CPA funds. However, what about the opportunity to do joint conservation housing projects with limited development concentrated on the most appropriate portion of the site and the remainder protected and available to the new housing units for outdoor recreation? Or redevelopment of underutilized historic buildings for housing with undeveloped portions of the same property being protected as open space. Seems like projects that address multiple interests could build cooperation too. Judi, I'm gonna hand this one over to you first.
I love this question, Heidi. Thank you so much. The reason I did not bring up conservation and housing is that, frankly, in my experience, with few exceptions, the conservation and housing people have already figured out how to work together. I don't see that problem the way I did 20 years ago, or that issue. Has it gone away completely? No. But I've seen much more collaboration between open space and conservation and housing than I have between economic development and housing. I can think of any number of places that that's been the case. And so, and actually within the last 18 months or so, I worked on a study of the impact of mixed use development in a community near Boston, and talked to the department heads in that community about what they were seeing. And the person who spoke up most passionately about wanting to promote redevelopment of existing structures was the conservation director, who said, you know what, it's cleaning up stormwater problems. When developers come in and take a vacant or dilapidated or simply, obsolete building, and they clean it up and they turn it into housing and some shops, they're cleaning up a stormwater problem that no one else was going to be able to solve. So I see a very constructive conversation happening that I did not see a few decades ago. That said, I think the question is important, and I apologize if I just kind of appeared to completely neglect it. There are certainly opportunities in regulatory and in policy to wed the interests of trying to take a conservation perspective in how we site housing. I think the master plan is the place to start with that conversation. Is where do you want to build and what do you need to save? And then how can you bring those two together? What opportunities do you have to use development to also save open space? And I think we have lots of examples of that. We certainly have examples of adaptive reuse that have taken historic buildings and converted them to housing use. So those are all tools that are available. What I frankly see is a need to build the conversation between economic development folks and housing. Peter Foreman is definitely the exception to that rule. He's figured that one out. And I appreciate South Shore Chamber's leadership on this, but it's still an issue out there, and I think we need to deal with it.
Judi, can I ask you, we get some of these questions when we go to local boards and there are housing projects, and there's an effort of people trying to do the right thing, thinking that all of the right things have to be done on the same parcel of land. So with Heidi's question about can you reserve some space for open space and have tighter construction? Yeah, there are large enough parcels that you can do that. But one of the, I think one of the new issues that we're discovering with local officials, that in trying to do the right thing, they're maybe trying to squeeze too much into individual projects and not looking at how one project complements something else in the same area. And I think that's an area where a lot of the discussion and planning can be helpful in thinking of how do you have projects that add to a stronger location, even though it may be a separate parcel of land.
Yeah, well, I think missing middle conversations about missing middle housing are a great way to advance that conversation, because, the sort of concept of you have kind of a compact development and gradually something that looks, less intense, but sort of in between the sort of more rural or less developed parts of town and the center is this graduated mix of housing. And so that's one way, Peter, I think communities, especially suburban communities, need to think about this, that as a planner, I would much prefer to see vertical mixed use development, but I get the idea that sometimes horizontal mixed use is a way to get at getting things closer together, and also being realistic about the developers in your community. Not every developer wants to do, and it really is capable of doing, vertical mixed use. I've run into this as well. So thinking about what the capacity of the developers is in your community, and working with that kind of makes sense. And sometimes that means you may be starting with and working for quite a while with horizontal mixed use, but still has to be compact. It has to make sense.
I would say, I would like to just offer an example in our community. One of the things that I referenced earlier was the Shovel Works site that we had. It was one of the 11 most endangered historic sites in the country. It was the manufacturing facility of the first shovels that built the Transcontinental Railroad. And it was starting to, go into ruins a little bit. And so the developer was looking at preserving it from a historic standpoint, redeveloping it and reusing and repurposing it. It also cleaned up some environmental issues there as well, and is adjacent to the downtown in our historic district. And, you know, septic and sewer is a problem down there. That's where all the village neighborhood homes on the very small lots were, with some failing septic. And there wasn't enough septic to support the downtown, so we couldn't have restaurants there. And so this was before I started on the board, but I was an advocate for this project. The town administration worked with the developer to come to a deal where they would have the developer overbuild the capacity of the wastewater treatment facility and run some of that excess sewer into the downtown and to some of those neighboring homes. That project also has between 30% and 80% area median income. So it is a real true mixed affordable units. It's, I don't know, 8 or 9 years old now. I actually live in the neighborhood, and it's beautiful. It's well maintained. There's no problems. I thought that when people left their house, there would be 120 cars times 2 leaving at 7:30, the same time I was leaving for work every day and coming back. That's not what it looks like. Understanding the traffic patterns are very important. And it really revitalized our downtown and was a catalyst. If anybody's been to Easton and gone to the Farmer's Daughter, there's lines out there every weekend. La Cucina is a new restaurant. There's a pizza shop. And that was all really as a result of housing, but it was housing that was very well thought out and planned. It preserved historic structures. It achieved some affordability goals, and it also did preserve some open space. So that, you know, there are a lot of projects like that that can be done well. I see some comments coming in about open space, and that's why looking at the way you plan for that so that you can optimize the open space as a balance or repurpose, like you said, Judi, is really so important.
I'd like to weave together a few questions that we've gotten in that are sort of related to one another. So there's a statement here that affordability is directly linked to demand, and demand drives prices. Ours is a committed capitalist nation. So then there's another question about how do we handle the disconnect between what developers want to build and what is profitable for them to build, and what communities actually want. For example, studies show that 55+ folks want smaller one-story homes, but developers often build larger homes on larger plots. And related to that, how can a community attract good developers? Who'd like to take that one?
I'll take part of that. The question about price is directly related to demand is only partially true. It's also related to type of product, which is one of the things I like that we came out as a chamber with our housing initiative, was something that we thought was a bit of a market approach to housing prices other than the traditional, you know, straight subsidy. It was build more of what the market demands. And what we found is that the market is demanding a lot more less expensive housing, not price points per se, but products that are less expensive to build, like the multifamily or some of the compact neighborhoods or smaller homes that people were looking for, and there weren't enough of that. So I think responding to the market can sometimes influence pricing in a way that is more attractive for a lot of people. Likewise with developers, yes, every developer would like to get the maximum amount of money imaginable out of any project, but they have to deal with market realities, and they will build what the market is looking for. It used to be in the 90s, you would see McMansions on small lots. That's not what the market's looking for now. Developers may have got more money from that, but they're going to respond to what the market is looking for, not just straight up demand supply at that particular moment. So I think I got part of that question, Joanne, but I think there were 3 parts.
Oh, you did. Good. Judi?
Yeah. I'll try not to dominate this. Let me give you a little story about zoning. When you zone for big lots with wide frontage, You are not going to get single-story homes for people who are older. It's not economic. If you want to get smaller homes, you need to shrink your lot size. You need to shrink your frontage. You need to really think about how do you make land economics work for affordability. That's absolutely key. And so I so often see in the communities I work in that people say they want, older adult housing, and they want certain outcomes from development, but everything in their zoning says the opposite. So I would just say, you have to think about what kind of housing product is your zoning asking for, because that may tell you a lot about why you're not getting it. I also think too that the sad lesson for me as a planner is that when communities don't plan strategically and zone strategically for a mix of housing, they end up getting a lot of comprehensive permit applications and they blame 40B. And I think that that's kind of an unfortunate thing, because the capacity to do a mix of housing and to provide a mix of affordability is in the hands of communities. It is very clearly part of the purpose statement of Chapter 808 of the Acts of 1975, which is the daddy of the current zoning act that we are still living with. It's very clear that zoning for lower moderate income housing is a purpose of zoning. But so many communities don't zone for it. And then they blame another law because it's getting forced on them. And I just think that including, folks, the loss of land that you really may want to protect becomes kind of a target for where you don't want growth. My view as a planner is when you start any planning process, the first question you ask is not what do you want to grow, but what do you want to save? That's the most important question in any planning process, is what do you want to save? You establish that. Now you have to look at where is growth okay? And you have to make growth work in those areas in order to take pressure off that land and to be able to then make strategic open space acquisitions that meet your open space needs, meet the needs of conservancy, and at the same time meet the needs of people and your economy, and what it means to have a whole community. So I just have to say, I think these things are fixable, but it really, in my view, starts with planning leadership and understanding that your job as a municipality, what does any government do? It solves conflict, right? What does government do? It solves conflict. Planning is a way for you to ward off the past what those conflicts are going to be. And I will be the first to admit, I've seen some very unfortunate losses of open space as a direct result of failure to plan. So it's really, I think the tools are in your hands, but you got to use them.
I'd also add that, attracting the right developers for your community, you do the work in advance on that. You zone for where you want the housing. The state has just voted to enact housing choice, which makes some of the decision-making on that a little less burdensome, so the majority can vote for the kinds of housing that they want. And I see that Chris Kletchman is on this call, so I'd like to give her a shout out for the incredible work that she did to help advance that. And it's a great tool for communities to use. And also having the plans and the backups to be clear about the kind of housing that you want, whether you want smaller housing or single family or multifamily. It's really important to be clear that that's the kind of housing you want, where you want it, what the zoning is for, and then to be friendly to work with. Have the tools like online permitting, have a development review team, so that when somebody does come forward, some of the things that I hear also are, if somebody owns land, the town can't tell them what to do with it if they're working with the land within your existing bylaws. So work with them to do something that's going to be productive for the community whenever you can, because when I'm voting on something, I always look, what's the best case scenario and what's the worst case scenario? You always think of what can happen. And there's a lot of horror stories out there about people that said no to a reasonable housing development, and then it turns into something that they really didn't expect was going to happen afterwards. So I think it's just worthwhile to think about that. Those decisions are really long-term decisions for your community. But if you're a community that's fair to do business with, and I'm not saying that Easton thinks every project that comes down the line is good for us. We don't. But we thoroughly think about it, vet it, bring it to the boards and committees, and take public feedback on it. And I think that, you know, we've done some really great projects in our town that have been complementary and advanced economic development. So I guess the takeaway for me on that would be a good community to do business with if you want the good developers to work with you.
That's right.
I want to take it down a little bit to more technical level. All of you spoke a little bit about the importance of data and formulating arguments for choices that are made on housing in communities. So there's a question here about what data should we use to support housing development as a non-impact on community rents? And if it does have an impact on rents, how do we offset it? So I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts on that specifically, or if in general, if anybody has any tips on where to access good data for housing arguments. In particular, I'd like to thank Chris Clutchman. He shared a link with us that I've posted into the chat for everybody to access with some data about communities from the state. But Dottie, Peter, Judi, do you guys have any additional tips on data?
I think it depends on the issue in your town. Some issues that come up are somewhat legacy myths, like impacts on schools, and I think you can get school data to show that. You might be able to get data if you're looking at a downtown area or a mall area. You might be able to pull data to talk about what happens to those areas when you bring in housing. It depends a little on the argument, but I wouldn't overstate the significance of data, because so often, at least when we're involved with projects in towns, the opposition is more emotional. And you can have a lot of data, but when people are making emotional arguments and their minds are closed, it doesn't matter that much. You're not going to respond to them. You might be talking to a different audience with the data. But always important to listen not only to what's being said, but what isn't being said, and to understand what is going on in that community and what the real issues are. But you know, I have found people who are opposed to housing for reasons they won't discuss. It doesn't matter how much data you give them. And that's where local leadership, I think, is important, from elected officials, from private citizens, from business leaders, to talk about the long-term health of a community and why you constantly need new investment, fresh blood, new residents to keep energizing a community. If you like the feel of your community and want to save it, you've got to constantly change it a little bit in order to save it.
I love that comment, Peter, because so many towns I work in, one of the first things people say is, nobody goes to town meeting. We go into town meeting, it's all gray-headed people. And I think, you know, we've designed government in so many ways that I don't even think we realize encourages participation by certain group and discourages it from others. I'm such a big fan of the remote participation now, which I know, Peter, you may not be all that wild about, but to me, it's opened up participation opportunities for younger families who don't go to community meetings at 7 o'clock at night because they need babysitters. If you want to have the conversation be broadened in your community, look at the opportunities that you create for people to serve on boards and commissions, and how the appointment process works. What support do you provide those groups in order to make the decision-making process work that they have? I think you're going to find, if you diversify the mix of people who are leading your government and your community conversations, you're likely to get somewhat different answers than you get when everybody looks like my age or older. And I admit I'm certainly the oldest person on this panel right now, so whatever.
And I would say this was kind of a softball thrown of where do you get the data? go to your regional planning agency. There's a lot of resources there for housing, transportation, and I see some other planners from regional planning agencies on the call as well too. So Old Colony Planning Council certainly has data about transportation, traffic counts, school-aged children, and other examples like I had mentioned before of where in the communities that surround you, what are they doing with housing? We have 17 communities that we support, so we have a really good bird's eye view of how communities are doing things. When I first started on the select board, there was a roundtable that the Metro South Chamber convened of electeds to talk about these issues. What are the biggest barriers to economic development in your community? So consider, working with your regional planning agency to support convening a roundtable of the communities that are near you and similar to you, and have these conversations. It's really an important topic, and I think people would be really willing to participate.
Thank you, everyone. All right, so it's 1:57 and we're going to wrap up soon. Before we do, I'm just wondering if any of the panelists have any final thoughts, any idea about what the next big thing in housing is, or the hot topic that people should be thinking about to kind of get ahead a little bit.
Yeah, I'll jump in. And then I won't say another thing for the rest of this meeting. In the last year, I've seen many communities create diversity, equity, and inclusion committees. And I think it's a great move. A lot of them aren't talking about housing. And I think at some point, you got to look at what does it mean when you say you support diversity, equity, and inclusion? If in fact, the number one thing that makes it possible for people to influence the conversation in your town or city is a barrier to their participation, then you're not going to get diversity, and you're not going to get equity, and you're not going to be able to be the inclusive place you say you want to be. If you don't have a job base that's mixed, that provides people a variety of opportunities to work in their town or to work close by, then I don't know how you get to diversity, equity, inclusion beyond saying, yeah, we have a DEI committee. So I think that if we're going to have these conversations, let's get honest about it. And let's recognize that in many ways, our communities, however unwittingly, need to kind of do a self-assessment. And when we say these things, what do we mean? And does our whole policy framework actually support what we say we want to be as a town or the city?
I jump in to add that I think that, environmentally, if the state is trying to get to net zero in 2050, we have to look at the way we're building our houses and using some green infrastructure to be very sensitive and thoughtful to the environmental needs that we have. We need to look at ways to have housing that is considerate of our water and our infrastructure, and it can be done. I've sat on many committee meetings with people from the climate, for housing, workforce, working together and having seats at the table to discuss those issues so that we can look at creating better, more sustainable housing for our communities is really going to be super important.
I would agree with Dottie. I think for us in our work at the South Shore Chamber, the next frontier on promoting housing is probably to be looking at infrastructure, particularly water and wastewater. And that doesn't mean that we don't build because of it, but it's figuring out how do you smartly build capacity for wastewater treatment and water supply in areas where there is a lot of growth or potential growth, so that you're doing it responsibly. But you shouldn't, we don't agree water, wastewater, even traffic should be used as excuses not to grow your communities and not to promote housing. But getting at that issue of infrastructure, Dottie's right.
And Joanne, if I can just weigh in and more holistically here, is that I've said this often, river and streams don't end at different town lines. Infrastructure, roads, bicycle lanes, workforce, it doesn't stay within a community. we have to be regional. We have to be thinking more global. We as a regional planning agency needs to work with our colleagues at the MAPC and SERPID if we're going to be looking and developing and really kind of making sure that we're talking to each other. You know, the CEDS committee, I highly recommend for you to be joining that, to reach out to Old Colony Planning Council and your other regional planning agencies. We have, I know I see the list, but Sheila Sullivan Jardin from the Mass High or Greater Brockton, as well as Chris Cooney, Peter's colleague in terms of chamber. We have to have these conversations, not just within OCPC, but within our region, and talk with our transportation folks as well. But I really appreciate the work that Joanne and our panelists, you know, I think there were more questions that need to be asked. And I think what we'd like to see from my perspective is that we have continued dialogue about housing and its relationship with economic development community planning. So I thank you. And Joanne, I know you're going to end with some comments at the end about some instructions for those attendees.
Sure. Thank you, everyone. So there are, I know, some questions that we weren't able to get to. I will try and follow up with those folks so that you guys do get answers. If anybody else has any thoughts after watching a recording of this again, or pops into your mind while you're sleeping or taking a shower, I did put my email address in the chat. You can reach out to Old Colony Planning Council anytime, and we'll try and get some answers for you. I think the one thing that we heard consistently from all three of our panelists today is that communication and collaboration are really key when it comes to housing and economic development and all of the issues that intertwine with those topics. Thinking of ourselves as planners, but also as communicators, I think is a little bit outside the box for many of us who like our data and our long reports and things like that. But that really is crucial, and that's where the collaboration comes in. So that's all that we've got for today. I hope everybody found this webinar useful. Thank you very much, Dottie, Peter, and Judi, for your time today. We really do appreciate it. After you leave this webinar, you will be redirected to a link to a survey. If you could provide us with some feedback, that'd be great. It's only with your feedback that we can make these webinars even better for you in the future. Slides and a recording will be available in the next couple days. I do have everybody's email addresses from your registration, so I will email you when those become available. And once again, if you've got any other questions, contact Old Colony Planning Council or your local regional planning agency. We're here to help. Thank you, everyone.